So in this video playlist, I'm going to take you through a series of steps on how to create interactive web-based resources, e.g. teaching resources or games or whatever it is that you want to make. So I'm not going to go into HTML and CSS in depth, and there is another video in my HTML playlist about things like position and sizing, so I'll include that in this playlist, but I'm going to take you through the basics, the elements that I've used on some of the pages that I've created, and also how we can use class ID to both style things and to be able to refer to them later on when we start the JavaScript programming. So I'm just going to look at a few example pages first so we can see the sort of elements that I've used. So I use divs a lot. So my binary page, for example, each of the digits is the HTML element div, and obviously I've animated it so you can do various things with it. The techniques we're going to look at actually work with any kind of element. So the menu, for example, you could do that with divs, but actually because they are links, you can actually style anything to look the same. So if I make this smaller, we can see that they're text here. So these, I could have done them with divs, but I can do the same thing with the A tag. So these are actually anchors, they're actually hyperlinks, and I've styled them to be rectangular and coloured, just as I can do with divs or paragraphs or anything. So have a think about kind of the meaning of your page, what we would call kind of semantic layout, and use a type of element that's relevant to the thing that you're doing. So obviously this isn't a navigation item or a paragraph, so I've used a div for that purpose. As I said, I've also used div for the menu. There's no JavaScript involved in this. This is pure CSS, and I'll show you a little bit about hover, etc. in a minute. So this is also uses divs. So there's a larger black div, and then each of the LED elements is a round-ended div. I quite like rounding things. It makes things look a little bit more stark, and also allows you to create things that are completely round. So the traffic light, this is so some of you have been in the game a while might recognize this from a few years ago. It was a J275, was it? Coursework task when they had to do 2. So this was a traffic light. So this is all divs. There's no images used in this. Notice that you can also apply things like gradients. So I'm going to show you how to make a quite plain traffic light in a minute, but in my particular example, I've used a radial gradient, so it looks brighter in the middle where you'd imagine the bulb would be, to make it look a little bit more realistic. You can do kind of vertical, horizontal gradients, etc. So you can look that sort of information up on the internet. I'm sure there's lots of YouTube videos on how to do CSS. But basically what this is, it's a larger div for the background and then 3 divs inside it, which I've styled to be round and have that gradient background. This page is a demonstration of a kind of bit like monochrome images, but also how you can create a font using binary, but each of the pixels is a div, so I've just arranged them in rows of 8 plus input boxes. So it's worth remembering or becoming aware of the different types of element that you can have on a web page. So here I've used input. You can also use, so that's just a standard input, and it will let me put an A in it, a standard text input box, but you can have number ones which have radio buttons, and actually the browser will do the validation for you. You can include things like this includes sliders, so that's a standard HTML element that I've included there, and I've added obviously the JavaScript to get it to do something. The color swatch at the bottom excuse me, is just again a div where I'm setting the background color as the sliders are moved. This is a more recent page. It's a connections wall. If you've seen Only Connect, this sort of thing might look familiar. So the black rectangle is a div. So you'll start to develop the idea of a kind of container. Quite often it's useful to put stuff in containers because it's useful sometimes to resize things. So if you put these things in a container, then we can center the container on the page, and we can also consider the kind of sizing of it. So what this does is it obviously resizes to fit the page, and then within the outer div there are inner divs, and I can change the color. So if we look at If we actually do this wall, things we can do to a file, we can close, we can write, we can read, and we can open. So what's happening there as I'm selecting them is I'm changing the background color. So we'll have a look at that in a later video. And then when I've selected 4 that match, it'll rearrange them and put the ones that I've matched at the top. So it's changed the image. So how it's done that is there are 2 classes, or there's actually 5 classes, was 1 for each color, plus the unselected tile, and then it changes their position. So they're positioned absolutely, which means they're positioned with coordinates rather than just kind of floating inside the box like Word would, but they're positioned inside a relative positioned box. So some CSS stuff takes a bit of getting used to. I'll also say with this at this point, it can be tempting to use hover. So hover can be used to change a style in CSS. And in fact, when I first made this page, the first version, it did change the color of the tiles as you moved the mouse pointer over them, so you could see which one was selected. However, when I tried that on my phone and on a touchscreen Chromebook, it did look a bit odd because obviously there is no hover event with a touchscreen until you actually touch it. But what that meant was when you pick the final one of the category, it left that final tile in the hover state, which looked a little bit weird. So that's that. And then another recent one, I'll just refresh that so it starts again. How this works is each row is a div, and within each row, each of the characters is also a div. And so I can select those and see if I can get one that's not. There's 2 types of question on this one. Got that answer wrong, that's rather embarrassing. So there we go. So there we go. So it's either ones where you select the digits or you type in the value, so that's 5. What's happening here is the rows are all the same apart from the background color. So when you style things, you can style them specifically by name, or you can say you can style things according to the order. So you can say make every 3rd one green, for example, or make the first one of that type green. So each row is a div, and it contains the divs for digits, just like the binary page, and they're positioned again absolutely within a relatively positioned box. And so I'm calculating the position for the next row, and when you get one right, they all shuffle down. And they shuffle down just using a transition. So I'll just change the position of them and they move down. And we'll have a look at transitions and transformations in the next video. Also, I'm a fan of border radius, which I can use for just rounding off the corners. So if you go back to the binary, you can see these are divs, but they've got the corners rounded off. That's quite easy to do in CSS. And in fact, you can create a whole kind of structure. So what these are, the coloured things in my Simon game, if I just refresh that, are the coloured buttons are divs, but I've used border radius to round off the corner, and I don't know whether you can have that kind of concave rounding on other corners, but all I've done is I've positioned a black circle in the middle on the top. And when you can layer divs and elements using a CSS property called Z-index, and it works a bit like center back in Word. So the higher the Z-index, the higher up it appears. And sometimes you need to use that. So sometimes if you just kind of make a page like this, what happens is you get strange things like your menu going under the digits. So sometimes you need to do a little bit of control. And actually, you can position all these things in 3 dimensions as well. So this is a rotating cube that I made. It's pure CSS, there's no JavaScript in here. And actually how it works is there are just 6 square divs, and you can position things in 3 axes. So you can transform them in the X, Y, and Z axes and rotate them in CSS. So that's just 6 squares, 6 divs, 6 square divs, just rotated into positions such that they form a cube. So that's there's no programming involved in that. If you're interested in that, look up CSS keyframes. You can also do it in 2 dimensions as well. So if you want to do the sort of thing that schools traditionally did in Flash. So that's kind of some examples of why you would use these things. Let's have a look now at just making them. So for these video tutorials, I'm going to be using Blue Griffin. I'm quite new to this. I've been doing JavaScript for about 25 years, and in the past few years I've been using Expression Web. However, quite recently, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, it was removed from the Microsoft website, so it's no longer available for use. If you have got a copy of that and you want to see it in use, it's used in my HTML videos, but actually it doesn't matter because I'm a big fan of being able to see the source code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new page, and I'm going to hide the panel on the right for the time being. And I'm a big fan of using dual view. So I did a lot of research when I was trying to decide a replacement for Expression Web, and lots of web page editors either don't have a proper code view, it's just like viewing the code in a browser so you can't actually edit it, or they don't have a proper WYSIWYG editor, so it's just like a kind of preview of what the page is going to look like. But Blue Griffin I like because it has both. So I'm going to switch to the dual view. So we can see how it works. So it's created my HTML5 document. It's selected the character set. So it's included all the kind of essentials. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, so you can either type stuff in the right hand side, or you can try and make it in the left hand side. So you can do things like, so if I was going to call this traffic light, then I could highlight that, and I could make it a heading 1, for example. But to maximise the amount of space I've got for my traffic light, I'm not going to bother with a heading. And sometimes you get residual bits of stuff left in here, so I'm going to just delete that. So what I'm going to add is I'm going to add a generic container. So the first thing you might want to do, so let's put a div in here. And quite often, I like to do this myself really, because quite often all tools seem to put unnecessary tags in there. Dreamweaver is a devil for putting pictures in paragraphs and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a div, which is a container for the whole traffic light, and then I'm going to have one for each of the individual lights. And div's a little bit strange because in this case, obviously, we're not going to have anything in. So div, it does behave like a paragraph in lots of ways, but in this case, we're not going to have anything inside it. So it's not going to have any text in there, but you could put text in there if you want to. Just a little word about text. Alignment, again, takes a little bit of getting used to. So if we go back to my examples, for example, my binary game, because everything's the same size, I know there's only one digit and only the things are only going to be one character tall, so like where it says 10 there or 5. They're positioned within the row div using padding. So padding is like a margin inside an element, and margin is a margin outside. So you can just add a bit of top padding to bring the stuff down. With things like the connection wall, because some of them have 2 or even 3 rows of text, that's a little bit more difficult to position vertically. So if you do want to do that sort of thing, have a look at flex boxes, okay? Because you can't use padding, because then it would start in the middle, so and then it would kind of go off the bottom. So centering stuff vertically is a little bit more tricky. Centering stuff horizontally is a lot more straightforward. So I've got my 3. So I've got my outer div, which is the whole traffic light, and within it I've got my 3 divs, which I'm going to use to represent the individual light bulbs. So what I'm going to do is, one thing to think about before you start is whether you want to refer to these things individually or all together, or either in your code or when you come to style them. So for example, the thing about these lights is they're all the same shape, they're all the same height, and they're all the same width, but they're different colors. So one way to approach that is to have to give them both a class. So the difference, if you're new to HTML, a class is a shared kind of property. So I'm going to I can give them a class of lamp, but they give them an ID. So an ID must be unique, but elements can share a class. So ID equals red. Now in HTML5 we don't need the speech marks. Some editors might still put those in for you. So what these things are going to have in common, they can have both a class and an ID. And in fact, you can have more than one class, in which case you do need the speech marks. If you want to give them two classes, you just put a space between them. And obviously I need to give them the right name, so that's red, amber, and green. And what you can do in your style section, so style usually goes in the header, and if you want to see whether you've got it in the right place, well, you can go through this kind of style features of your particular editor, but if you validate the page, it will tell you, using HTML5 validator, which are easily available online, it will tell you whether you've put the stuff in the wrong place. So in my style section, if you're not familiar with CSS, you can style everything with a selector, so you can style all divs, but they're not all going to be the same in this case, because the first one is the container for all of the lights, and then the other ones are the individual ones. You can style things by class, so in which case you begin the name with a dot, and then you can style things by ID, in which case you use the hash. So I'm not going to go through the the full detail of how to use CSS, but what I will say is, again, if you're a beginner with CSS, sometimes it gets a little you need to get your head around it, because you don't need to specify all the properties, you just need to specify the things that are going to be different. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use, because they've all got, I'm going to use lamp to specify all the things that are the same, and I'm going to use the ID to specify the things that are different. So the things that are different are the background color. So if I'm using a div, literally I'm just going to use the background color to create the color. So red has a name, which is red. Green has a name, which is green. And amber doesn't work, so for the time being we'll make that yellow. We'll come back and look at that. So if I have a look at here, I'm just going to save that. So let's put it somewhere. Web page. There we go. Let's call it traffic. Let's get rid of that capital T. Okay. So at the moment, it's not appearing, is it, in my preview? Probably because I haven't given it any sizes. So what I'm going to specify for lamp is, because they're all going to be the same size and they're all going to be the same shape, is some of those other properties. So I'm going to say width. Now, one thing that will take a bit of getting used to, again, is units. So probably so if we go back and have a look at my traffic light, think about a traffic light, you probably want it all to fit on the page. So if I make this narrower and wider, it doesn't actually need to change the height. But if I make the browser shorter, I want the traffic light to fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the width a percentage of the height of the viewport. So the viewport is the bit of the page you can actually see, rather than the width of the screen. There's a variety of units that you can use when you're sizing web pages. You can measure things in pixels. You can measure things in percentages, but you need to be a little bit careful with percentages. Again, if you're a beginner, you might be tempted to think, if you say height 30%, it's actually 30% of the height of the page, but percentage is always the width, and it's the width of the container. So my first div, if I say width 50%, it will be 50% of the width of the viewport. But if I say 50% on the one inside it, it'll be 50% of the container. So I think I quite like the new units. So that there are VH, which is viewport height, VW, which is viewport width, and the number is a percentage. So you say 50 VW, that means the thing will be sized 50% of the width of the visible page area. There's also vmin and vmax. So sometimes, I've used vmin on my my connection wall, for example. So if I make the page shorter, the tiles get smaller, and if I make the page narrower, they get shorter. So that's kind of the behavior that I want for that particular thing. So you can choose your properties or your dimensions according to what you want things to do. So I'm going to say, let's go for 30% of the viewport height for the width, and I want the height to be the same. So 30% of the viewport height, and then when I come to shape them, so now they've appeared. Now they've got a height and width. They weren't there before. And now I'm going to round them off. So I'm going to say border radius. Now you could measure how far it's the border radius is how far in the curve kind of starts. But what you can do to make it easy for yourself is you can just say 50%, and there's your traffic light. So what I haven't done is I haven't given this a name. So let's call it. So this is the container ID lights, and I haven't done anything with that. So that is a ID. So lights. So lights is all of them. So what I'm going to do with that, I'm going to say background. Now because the lamp ones, the circular ones, are inside, they will be automatically on the top, so I don't need to worry about Z index or anything like that. But I'll make the background black, and notice by default that div is the full width of the viewport. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that narrower. So how narrow do I want it? Well, I want it to be as wide as the light and a bit more. So I'm going to say maybe width 40%. So 40 VH. Notice it's as tall as it needs to be to fit in the bottom element. So you don't necessarily need to give it a height. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just so you can see this happening, I'm going to give the body. So the body is the whole page effectively. I'm going to give that a background color as well, and you'll see why in a second. So background color, and that's probably disappeared because I haven't got the closed. There we go. So what color are we going to make that? Well, you can specify colors by name, or you can specify colors by properties. So if I make it pale green, for example, so what's that going to be? So some red, some green, and some blue. So but more green. In fact, I probably make that a bit lighter. So if you're not sure how these color codes work, in fact, I've made a page. So you can see that the more of everything you have, the lighter it gets. And if you have the same amount of everything, it's grey. And obviously, if you have more red, it gets more red. But also, you can think of your complementary colours. So if you make it less blue, it gets more yellow. But you can always look that up, different colours. So we're getting there. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to give my background a border, because traffic lights have white borders on there, if you notice. So border, I'm going to say, again, I was tempted to put a measurement in pixels there, but I think it's good to be consistent throughout with your units. So if I just say, let's try 3 VH. So solid, so you can have dashed, dotted, etc. white. Okay. Yep, so that's about the right sort of thickness. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to round that off a little bit. So I'm going to say border radius, because actually they're not perfectly sharp on the corners, are they? So border radius, again, I'll just go for, you can either go for a percentage, or if I go for 3 VH for that as well. Yeah, maybe a bit more. Maybe go for 5 or something. That's the thing, you can do it by trial and error. That might be a little bit too much. So what's going on there? Well, the other thing you can do is, if I wanted that to be centered on the page, the easy way to center things horizontally is actually to just say margin auto. And that will put things in the middle. So that's a neat CSS trick for centering stuff on the page. What we haven't done there is the lights are touching, aren't they? So what I'm going to do with the lights, and again I'm going to do it on the lamp class because this is something that's common to all of them, is if I just give them a margin. So remember, margins are on the outside. So I deliberately made so the lights are 30 wide, but the thing's 40 wide. So if I go margin 5, there you go. That will kind of space them out. So those are the kind of ideas. So you can put divs inside divs and space them out and things to make it look like you want it to do. It's also useful to think about the classes and IDs. So classes are for groups of things all with the same properties. So all the lamps have the same size, etc., but they're different colors, so you can style those things separately, as I've just demonstrated. Also, these IDs and classes are going to be used in our JavaScript later on to refer to these elements. So if I want to change the background color of a lamp, if I want to change the background color of the red one, I can refer to it by ID. So I can say get the thing with the ID of red and change the background color. But you can also get things by class. But obviously, if you get things by class, there might be more than one of them because IDs need to be unique, classes don't. And so what will happen then is they'll be put into an array, effectively, called a collection. And you can cycle through them with a loop. So you can say, get the things with the class of lamp, put them into an array, make the first item 0, make that red, make item 1 amber, make item 2 green, and so on. You can actually, in JavaScript, select things by just one of these CSS selectors. So we're going to, so you can say, fetch all divs or all text boxes, for example, as well. So that's just a few things to think about. So how you structure your page and what you call those different elements on the page, and then you can use that to style it. So as I said, have a look at the HTML video. There's a bit more information on the position property and also the display property. So display will affect how things can appear kind of next to each other, and whether you can get a div to wrap like text, which might be useful sometimes. So for example, if you've seen my top trumps page, the cards kind of wrap. That can be useful. And position is how you position them on the screen. So by default, divs will appear just in the order that you put them on the page, like words or paragraphs would, but you can use absolute if you want to position them using kind of coordinates. So if you always want something to be in the middle of the page, for example, you could say top 50%, left 50%. Or you can also have, there's another type now called fixed. So if you look at a web page, for example, let's pick one with a lot of text on it. There we go. So if I scroll this up now, you'll see that the heading doesn't move, and nor does the menu bar on the left-hand side, and that's because they're divs, but they are positioned using fixed. So absolute means within the whole page, and fixed means you can position it by coordinates within the viewport, within the window you see. So if I said, if my heading was absolute top 0, it would be top of the page as it is now, but it would go up when I scrolled. If I say fixed top 0, it'll be at the top of the window, and it will stay there as the other content moves. Obviously, you need to be a little bit careful with that because you need a big margin to stop your other text appearing under there. So experiment with some CSS, get it looking like you want to, but probably divs are going to be your friend.